so whenever you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. I'm really excited and happy to be here today with my dear mentor, Professor Willard Peterson. We are here at his home office in Princeton, and well, we're gonna have a conversation about everything, like how did you about you basically, how you became the kind of person scholar that you did. So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for coming and doing this whole interview.
Of course.
That's very good of you to do that.
Yeah, I'm very glad to. So why don't we start by talking about your, childhood, early years. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, which is the first suburb straight west of the Loop, next to Chicago. Mm-hmm. So it's a suburb, but I live 3 or 4 blocks from actually the Chicago city limits. So it was technically a suburb. I lived there from before kindergarten until I went away from college. I went to Oak Park Public Schools the whole time. And that Oak Park is where Frank Lloyd Wright had his studio. Oak Park is where Ernest Hemingway grew up and went to the same high school. So wow. It was a very, what I would call, stable, ordinary, middle class start.
So what were you like as a child?
Probably depends on who you ask.
Your parents versus.
Well, I have 3 brothers and I'm the third. And my oldest brother, who's 8 years older, basically, I think because of lack of imagination on the family's part, he basically had to do everything my father had done. So he went to the same college, he was an engineer, and then went into the insurance business. My second brother was really a good student compared to me, and good in the sense that he did everything the teachers wanted, he didn't misbehave, and I think I benefited enormously by the good reputation that he has established. So the teachers, we had the same teachers because we had gone to the same school. But I think because of his more or less exemplary behavior, I was cut a lot of slack.
So you're saying you were not so exemplary after all?
Well, I liked school for being with my friends. Mm-hmm. I like the community thing of being in school and interacting and so on. And I can still remember the names of all my teachers, and all through 8th grade, they're all females, of course.
Yeah.
And all but one were unmarried females, which was what it was in those days. And some of them were very good teachers. And then my first and second grade teacher was Miss Henry. And at the end of 2nd grade, it was the only time I had all E's, E for excellent, and in my whole life, actually. And she wrote on that report card, because my parents showed it to me, and I still remember this, and it said, he's not living up to not working to his potential.
Oh, wow.
And so they saw more potential in me than I was probably demonstrating, which I thought was very good on the part of teachers.
That's right, and also said at that time you were more interested in social relationships.
Well, sports. So we did sports after school every day, all the time, and so basically, because school was easy, I didn't feel I had to put in any extra effort and so on, and which was probably a bad habit that I still have.
Oh well, you haven't done too bad for yourself, so.
Well, but what I'm emphasizing is part of succeeding in education may partly depend on the teacher's indulgence. Rather, usually we think of education as a result of effort you put in. And I, for all kinds of bad reasons, partly because I didn't want to be like my second brother, who did work hard and did everything the teachers told him, I was somewhat rebelling against. I wasn't a bad rebel, but I liked school, but I didn't think that you needed to do a lot of hard work for it.
Right.
And I didn't suffer, I feel, for that. So
Right.
when I graduated from 8th grade, then Miss Altsager, who was my 7th and 8th grade teacher, and she was the most formidable teacher in the school. And the principal didn't run the school, she ran the school. So she's the one who recommended me to be on the literary magazine when we went to the high school. And so in every way, they were supportive, which I appreciated.
Were you an avid reader?
Was I what?
An avid reader?
Well, I was an avid reader in the sense that my mother said, you don't need to read so much, but I would read junk. I would read this cereal box.
Yeah.
I wasn't, so we go to the Oak Park Public Library from time to time, but from probably 6th grade or so on all through high school, we went away to northern Wisconsin for the whole summer, because we had a summer house there. And again, that was all outside, it wasn't academic. And in the house that we had there, that my parents had bought, there's this huge old collection of Reader's Digests. And so I would read Reader's Digest, which is not really that edifying, but it gave me a broad spectrum of things,
Right.
but it's kind of at a lower level. So I would read junky novels, I would read, but I wasn't, I would read anything, I still do this, that's a bad habit, I'll read anything if I think it's interesting.
But that's not a bad habit. Why?
But I would say I stayed very open to things.
Yeah.
And so when I graduated from high school, my oldest brother had gone to Illinois Institute of Technology, where my father had gone to be an engineer. My second brother went to Grinnell and became a pre-med and became a doctor. And I knew I did not want to go to school in Chicago, and I knew I didn't want to go to school in the liberal arts college in the Midwest.
Okay.
And one day, probably in the fall semester of my senior year, passing by the dean's office, there was a notice of people coming to give college interviews. And I noticed there's this person coming from the University of Rochester. And in the year before me and 2 years before me, there were people, I thought, I didn't know them that well, but I thought, these are admirable people. And they had gone to the University of Rochester. I'd never been to the University of Rochester, didn't know anyone from the University of Rochester. So I signed up to have the interview, and it must have done well, because then they offered me a scholarship to go to Rochester.
Wonderful.
And in the spring, in March of 1956, the Dean of Seniors called me, and the only other time I'd been called in to see a dean was when I was a sophomore. And the sophomore dean, Russell Fugue, I still remember his name, called me in because I didn't wear a belt. And he said, if you don't wear a belt, you should drop out of high school, which I thought was an extreme. But so when I was the spring semester senior, Dean Fitzsimmons called me in and said, have you applied to college? And I said, yeah. And he said, where? I said, to the University of Rochester. He said, that's all? I said, yeah. Because my parents really gave me no advice about anything. So he said, would you consider going to Northwestern? And I didn't really want to consider it, but I didn't want to offend him. So I agreed to go to Northwestern to have an interview, even though I hadn't applied there. This is quite incidental, but the only time in my whole life so far where I've had a traffic ticket for a moving violation was going to that interview, because I was going west on like Diversity Avenue or something in Chicago, following the line of traffic. And at a certain point, there were Chicago police cars pulling everyone over, because the whole line of traffic was going 35 in the 30-mile-an-hour zone. And the Chicago police were doing their monthly quota of giving tickets. So everybody got a ticket going along there. But anyway, so I was admitted to Northwestern also. And then I went to my father and I said, I'm admitted at Rochester, admitted at Northwestern. Do you have any advice? And he said, no, figure it out.
So your parents gave you a lot of freedom, right?
Yeah, so my parents gave me a lot of freedom, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
And I remember I made a kind of list and based on cost. So to travel to Northwestern, the cost was trivial because it's just on the north side of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Cost to go to the University of Rochester was train tickets and round trips and so on. And because I had a scholarship at Rochester, the scholarship was covered more than it would cost compared to Northwestern. The food I figured would be more or less the same at each place. The books would be more or less at the same place. So I went to my father and said, it's probably better for me to go to Rochester.
Which was what you wanted to do
well,
in the first place.
I thought I wanted because I thought Rochester was in the east.
And it is not?
Well, it's west of the Appalachians, so it's not that far from Buffalo, and it's upstate New York, so it's not really East Coast. It's on Lake Ontario, which is kind of Midwestern lakes. So, but I didn't know any of that. But I think going to Rochester, because I didn't know what I wanted to do, I applied partly because of my father's model and my older brother's model to be in engineering, but I knew I didn't want to be in engineering. And then because I had this summer job working for an insurance company because I was good in math and they were recruiting people to do become actuaries. And my father arranged for a lunch with the guy who headed it, who was an actuary, who was trying to do the recruitment. And he said, oh, one of the good things that your son could do is to become an accountant and a lawyer. Because by combining accountancy and law, that would really be good. So then, before I got to Rochester, I sent him a letter that I want to change my intended major from engineering to business.
Engineering business.
Right. And they didn't care. And I was admitted to liberal arts college at Rochester.
Right.
And then actually in my freshman year, I can't remember the first semester, probably the second semester, I did an accounting course and maybe a business course, and I liked it because it was so easy and it's so practical, but it's so boring. So I knew very quickly I didn't want to do that. And also from my working, I had worked 2 summers at this insurance company in downtown Chicago, Continental Insurance, and I knew I did not want to work in the office.
Right.
But I didn't know what I wanted to do.
But at that time in your life, even before going to college, like at that age, more or less, like what were your hopes for the future? How did you see yourself doing? Did you have, like, what did you want to do with your life?
I had no idea. So my second brother knew in Oak Park Elementary School in 8th grade, one of the projects was to write a little kind of paper booklet on what your job career was going to be. And so my older brother wrote on being a doctor, which he became. My younger brother wrote on being a lawyer, which he became. They knew, and I wrote on being a commercial artist.
Commercial artist?
Well, I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I was interested in art.
Okay.
And to be a career, there's no career called being an artist.
Right.
In those
You
days.
put the word commercial in.
So you put the word commercial in, and I remember my father took me to one of his friends from when they were in grade school together in Chicago, who was a commercial artist and made lots of money doing the advertisements for Sears Roebuck, which was the big mail order company in those times. And he showed me the shop that they had, and I knew he didn't want to be a commercial artist either. So I really did not know what I wanted to be. But at Rochester, then you didn't have to declare a major until the end of your sophomore year. And partly because of some of my older friends were 2 or 3 of them were history majors, and they said, oh, this is a really good major. They had no idea what they were going to do either. but also because Rochester at this time had this special program called Honor Seminars, which you had to apply to get into.
Oh.
And because I'm an indifferent student in terms of grades, it wasn't too obvious that I would be allowed to go in, but partly by accident in my sophomore year, I was taking this year-long economics course. So it was 2 semesters worth of grade, but it was all calculated on the final exam. And I got an A on the final exam, and therefore I got an A for the semester, so it made my record look much better. But anyway, the honors program, it was in probably English literature, history, philosophy. I think there wasn't one in philosophy. Maybe literature, and then they were starting economics. And the honors program was a weekly seminar, and it counted as a double course. So in junior year, only allowed to take 1 honors seminar each semester. Senior year, you could take 2 honors seminars, and that was all you did, which I really liked. So I really like seminars, not lecture courses.
I can tell.
You can tell, right? Everybody I tell this to, they can tell. I like seminars much better than this, and I think students learn more from seminars than they do from listening to lectures.
Yes.
So anyway, I was admitted to the honors program, and then I had to say, in what? And so I said history, again, not really understanding the implications of that, not really having a career in mind. But what I liked in my sophomore year, I was doing this writing course, creative writing, and the professor was W.D. Snodgrass, who was a poet, won a Pulitzer Prize that year, very eccentric guy, very nice guy, but we had the seminars at his house. He lived in this decrepit farmhouse near Rochester. The wind would blow in through the floorboards and so on. But that's the first time I ever really understood how to read a poem. And so I wasn't going to be a poet, but he knew I wasn't going to be a poet because the way he talked to me. But just to understand and appreciate poetry by being with a poet and having him act out the poems, which was very influential on me. But then in junior year, the seminar, the honor seminar I was in, was given by this old man, Arthur May, who was about 6'5". He did the Austro-Habsburg Empire, and it was all about diplomacy. And there were only 8 students in these seminars, and so we were each given a country. And by default, I was assigned Japan. I knew nothing about Japan. But the important thing was we met in his house. And to meet in the seminar, and the bad thing was we would meet in the seminar, we'd take a break, and the females in the seminar would go to the kitchen and make the tea.
Oh my gosh, I don't know how I feel about
right.
that.
Well, this was in the 1950s.
That's
so,
right.
but it was noticeable that there was no expectation that the male students would go in the kitchen and make the tea. But I also remember Arthur May, he would sit all through the seminar, he'd hold his hands like this, covering his eyes. And you couldn't tell if he was asleep or not asleep. But because we would present our papers, so every other week, every second week, you had to write a paper and present it. And when you weren't writing a paper, you had to be the critic for one of the people that did. So it's, I'd never made students criticize the other students' papers, but that's what we did for 2 years. We wrote papers. Everybody in the seminar got a copy of it, and one person was the lead critic. But anyway, Arthur May would sit with his hand over his eyes like this, and if you split an infinitive, do you know what a split infinitive is? If you say, I'm going to the store, then I'm going to go is an infinitive, okay? And the old rule in English was you couldn't put an adverb in between the to and the go. So you couldn't say, I'm going to soon go to the store.
Oh, I see.
And so you couldn't put an adverb between the to and the verb itself.
That's splitting the infinitive.
That's splitting the infinitive.
I see. Okay.
All right. So he would take his hand away from his eyes and said, "Don't spoon feed the chicks."
Only for that.
Only for that.
grammar.
Well, because the criticism was to come from the other students.
Right.
So he
Right.
umpired it and guided it and so on.
But
But that's what I liked about seminars, is because we did the work. And they set up the syllabus.
I'm understanding so much now.
Because you've experienced this,
of
right?
course, and that's something that definitely I wanna, I wanna ask you about.
Right.
But
Right.
let's continue.
No.
So
Being in this honors program, they discontinued it within 10 years after I was there, because it's just a very expensive wage. The deans don't see that this is cost effective.
Yeah.
But as a form of education, I think it's terrific.
Do you think that works with any kind of students at any kind of institution, or?
Well, no, because there's some of my friends. They were good students. They wanted to go to graduate school, say in history, and they told me they didn't want to do that because they thought the graduate schools would not recognize it as good preparation, which I think is kind of crazy.
It's the opposite, no? It should be the other way around.
No, because
they don't have like the
because once you get to
memorized
graduate school, they depend on that you've acquired a lot of knowledge
Right.
in your undergraduate, and then they can do the seminars.
But perhaps they've learned to think.
Well, most people don't think of education as learning how to think. But I bought into that very early. So, and then once I get to graduate school, then it's seminars, and,
Yes.
and you don't have to sit through lectures, so learning to be a graduate student, learning to be a scholar is learning how to do it. It's not just piling up knowledge. The knowledge is on Facebook or on Wikipedia or
Especially
the
these
library.
times. No, I totally agree. But even in grad school,
Yeah.
I don't think like most seminars at any other departments at Princeton, for example, were like ours, like the ones we had.
Right.
Like now I'm understanding like who inspired you to teach in the very unique way that you teach.
But it's not unique. It's just
I
not as common as it should be.
It is not as common,
Right.
perhaps as it should be.
Right.
That's the thing, but it's like you basically, even at the undergraduate level, and you experience that yourself now and learning that you just don't say anything, like
Right.
don't say much.
Right. No, but
And you
learning,
let the students do the
learning how to
thinking.
speak in a group, no matter what your job is going to be, is actually very important. Because almost no matter what your job is, you're going to be in a
Absolutely.
group setting. You're going to have to talk about things you don't quite understand well enough.
Yeah.
And you have to get people to agree with it, or at least hear it. But I remember at one point, in the undergraduate seminar that you sat in on, we didn't normally do this, but one year it somehow came up at the last meeting, what did you learn in the seminar? And various people said various things, but one young woman who had a funny name, Zuzu or something like that, and she was very nice, and she was like the second or third people to say what she learned, and what she said she learned was how to conduct a seminar, which I said, you've learned. So, I mean, graduate students complain often that they're not taught about how to teach, but they've been going to school for a very long time.
That's how I feel.
And if they haven't observed what works and what doesn't work, how to communicate with the people.
And having good models. And like
Well,
just
good models,
learning
but
from
they're
the
there. But
teachers.
you can also figure out what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember at Harvard, I audited this English history professor, Jordan, I think was his name. And he read his lectures. And after like the fourth or fifth lecture, I noticed his graduate students would sit in the back and they'd have these notebooks open. They had a copy of his lecture and then they had a pencil. And if he changed a single word in the lecture that he read, then they brought back and they handed their copy of his lecture. But they all had the lecture already. There was no point in hearing it.
Right.
And there's no point in making the students sit there. They could have read it in 3 hours instead of going through a whole semester of hearing him read it.
Mm-hmm.
So in medieval times, when there weren't a lot of copies of books, to have someone sit at the head of the dining hall and lecture, that is, read out the text, that made sense as a way of disseminating information. But the lecture system, I think, it should be out.
No, no, I wholeheartedly
Yeah.
agree. And what I was surprised, like, of course, I sat in your graduate seminars, and we would do that. But when I sat in your undergraduate seminar in Chinese intellectual history, and I saw that you did exactly the same with undergraduate students who had no notion of China or Chinese philosophy or Chinese intellectual history, nothing. They had never read those texts. And you could just like sit there and let them talk, and they would actually manage the seminar and manage to have really interesting discussions. I was like, this is the teacher I want to be, and this is how I want to teach. And ever since I started teaching, just some years ago, it's my model of the Socratic kind of seminar.
A number of years ago, we were doing job interviews in Chinese history, and one of the people we brought for an interview had been an undergraduate, and she was a junior in the intellectual history seminar, and I wasn't present while this interview was going on, but my colleagues, they were Toby. And so one of them kind of meanly said, well, so what did you learn in Professor Peterson's seminar? And she said, I learned that I could say things and other people would take it seriously.
That's very important. That's very important. That's amazing. Yes.
So it worked.
Yeah.
You haven't been able to ask questions because I've been talking so much.
Well, you're answering all my questions. You're anticipating everything that I want to ask you. Well, but then, so you were saying about you decided to study history, and you had these amazing professors. When did you become interested in China specifically?
Well, my first exposure was in my junior year, because I was a history major at this time, and I had one seminar and then I had to take two other classes. I forget what the fourth class was, but the third one was Harry Benda. I don't know if you know his name, but he gave a lecture course on history of China and Japan. So that was my exposure. Harry Benda was actually a Southeast Asia specialist, and the year after I had him, then he went to Yale. And at AAS, you'll notice there's a Southeast Asia Harry Benda Prize.
Oh.
So he's a very influential person in Southeast Asian studies. So that course was the first exposure. You know, it was just I don't even remember what the textbook was, but that's when I learned a little bit about Chinese and Japanese history. And so that was in the spring of my junior year, and then Benda was supposed to give a seminar on Chinese history when I was a senior, but then he left to go to Yale, and they brought in Harry Hartunian. I don't know if you know his name. Tokugawa history. He was at Rochester, and then he went to the University of Chicago, and did basically Tokugawa intellectual history. So he comes in the first day of the seminar and said, you all think this is going to be about Chinese history. It's going to be about Japanese history because I don't know anything about Chinese history.
There you go.
So I didn't have really any, except for Harry Benda's one semester lecture course, I didn't have. But basically, when I decided in my senior year, I really ought to go to graduate school, and I didn't know, there was a kind of process of elimination. I knew I didn't want to go to graduate school in American history because then I'd work on some county in Kentucky for some decade in the 1880s, and that was kind of boring. And I kind of felt that about European history. It is very heavily studied, and you have to take a very small topic. But I said I knew enough about Chinese history that I knew it was totally understudied, especially in English. And so I applied in Chinese history. And I didn't know Chinese, never been to China, didn't know much at all. But again, probably because of Harry Benda, I had gone to Yale, he was in the history department there. I'm pretty sure that that's why I was admitted to Yale with next to no preparation. So at Yale, that's when I discovered that to study Chinese history, you have to know how to read Chinese, which no one had told me about.
They accepted you into the program. No,
but it couldn't be done now. But in those days, it was not uncommon.
It wasn't.
But I wasn't unique by any means.
So how did you go about learning Chinese?
Well, they had a program. So but at Yale at that time, they had not as Yale students, but they had the Chinese language program was training Air Force airmen, they must have been called, in Chinese. And they're basically training them in listening to Chinese so they could listen to the Chinese military on the radio and get that into English. But they had this very intensive course in Chinese. So I said, instead of doing it slowly, I'll just join this intensive course, because it was a very rigorous course. And that was fine. So I did seminar with Arthur Wright, who was one of the big people in Chinese history at the time. That was fine. We started with, I think my first paper was on the Yangshao pottery, and then we did bronzes, and so we did week by week some big things as seminars in Chinese history with Arthur Wright, and I learned a lot from that because it was quite detailed, and we wrote papers all the time. But see, by this time I felt kind of arrogantly that I knew how to write a paper. Right. What I didn't know is how to read Chinese. And I had already experienced writing graduate level papers, and I wanted more Chinese. So in the spring of my first year at Yale, Mary Wright, because she was one of the first, probably the first female professors at Yale. And she was the director of graduate studies, or the director of East Asia graduate students or whatever. She called me into my office and said, "What have you been doing? And you're studying Chinese with the Air Force." And I said, "Yeah, well, because I wanted to go faster." And she said, she didn't explain what was wrong with that. She just said, "We recommended you for a National Defense Foreign Language Fellowship, but this afternoon I'm calling down to Washington to take you off the list." So they weren't throwing me out of the program, but I was not going to have support.
Why?
Because I had to ask permission to study Chinese. And so then, so what was I going to do? And Toby's is influential and crucial at all junctures in my life, said, well, because she'd always wanted to go to England. She said, "Why don't you apply to England?" And I knew enough that there's a place called School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and I consulted something and said, "Oh, there's this person, Dennis Crispin Twitchett, who's the professor there." I had no idea who he was, but I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back and said, "Yes, come along." So there's no application or anything. These are older, easier days.
Yes.
But he had probably consulted Arthur Wright or something like that. Yeah. So yeah, it wasn't a non-entity, but and I remember when we landed in Le Havre in France in early September, and so as term did not start until October, so we basically, the two of us, hitchhiked from the coast of France to Vienna.
Sounds great.
And then back. But we arrived basically penniless in London, and then kind of by accident, I remember in part of our luggage, I realized I had put a bank check that I'd totally forgotten about. So we had $500 more than I knew we had.
Awesome.
But at London at that time, again, it really suited me without my intending it, that all you had to do for the master's degree was take the qualifying exams, which was basically just the undergraduate's final exams, and then write a paper. So there's no courses. So I studied more Chinese. Angus Graham was the person who taught Mengzi to the undergraduates. I was in on that. And so I passed, again, probably not that well, but I passed those exams. And then I went to Twitchett, who was the professor. And he said, "What do you want to work on?" Because no one had asked me that before. And at Yale, I had taken a seminar with Nelson Wu, whose name you don't know, but he was a really, really good teacher and very creative person who didn't get tenure at Yale. But in his seminar on Chinese painting, one of the most attractive parts was 17th century Chinese paintings. And my little brain said, no, if there's good paintings being produced in the 17th century, there must be very interesting other things going on too.
Sure.
So I told Twitchett, well, I wanted to work on the 17th century. Well, no one in that time in England worked on the 17th century in China. But he said, sure. And what topic? And there's like 3 names I knew from the 17th century, and the most prominent was Gu Yanwu. So I said, well, without knowing anything, I want to work on Gu Yanwu. He took me downstairs to the Chinese library in SOAS and showed me where the Nianpu were and said, here, read these.
Wow. There you go. And you could read Chinese at this time.
Well, I could a little bit, but what the most important thing that he did was he was the professor, and D.C. Lau was a reader or something, and said to D.C. Lau, not in my hearing, of course, but you should tutor him. So I had weekly tutor sessions, not on Gu Yanwu, and it wasn't going to be on early China, because I needed to know this later stuff. And D.C. Lau told me, not right at the beginning, but later, he never wanted to read anything after Buddhism arrived in China, because the Buddhists changed the whole thought system and language system so much, it was a different topic. He was only interested in early China. But he agreed that we would read a Nianpu on Daijun in the 18th century. Because he was somewhat interested, never read much about Daijun. So we started with Daijun. And so just reading with him every day, the discipline that provided, really, really helped me, because I couldn't have done my master's thesis without it. And so my master's thesis was on the life of Gu Yanwu, which is based on the Nianpu. So it wasn't a research problem so much as getting into English what was already in Chinese. But this is somewhat to the side, but when I first came to Princeton, almost all of my colleagues, their first writings were biographies. And because in those days, it was one of the easiest ways to identify and give a boundary to a topic. And again, I just stumbled into that. So I wasn't asking some big problem the way you were asking. There was a focused topic. I knew that it had a beginning and an end, and what could I do with it? So then, I wanted to stay at SOAS because it's very comfortable, very nice environment. Toby loved living in London. And D.C. Lau and the others said, you have to go to Harvard. Okay. And I said, I don't really want to go to Harvard. But they say, you have to go to Harvard. But again, there was no one in England during the 17th century. So it made sense. And because in those days, then Ellis Young was this great professor.
Which year are we talking about?
So I was in London from 1961 to finished in June of 64. Okay. So September 64, then I went to Harvard. Okay. And Toby really wanted to go to New York and for me to go to Columbia. And that would have been disaster for me, actually. Well, working with what I worked at Harvard compared to working with Tabari would have made me a quite different person. But, so when I then went to Harvard, then, I thought I knew something about Chinese history, partly because Gu Yanwu was such a good topic, again, without my knowing it, because he was such a great historian. And to read him, you have to go back and look at the sources where he's quoted from. And so I learned a huge amount through his writings about Chinese history. But at Harvard, have you ever been to 2 Divinity Avenue in the library there? That doesn't matter. But the library has this big reading room, and then off on the left there's a separate little reserve reading room, which has like 3 tables. Okay. And my office, we have those wooden Windsor chairs. Well, those are the kinds of chairs that I had at Harvard. So that's why I had them in my office. And I had my special seat, which is the first table when you go in the door, far on the left, with my back to the door. And at one time, this is one of the most important moments in my life, L.S. Young pads in, because his office was just on the hall. He wore slippers in 2 Divinity Avenue. So he walked very quietly. But he saw me sitting there. I was the only one in the room. And he comes over and he says, "You should submit your dissertation to Harvard Journal," which meant he was going to publish it.
Wow.
And so that was when, that's when my life really changed, I think.
Were you almost done with your dissertation?
Oh, no, I had finished it in London.
Your master's thesis, right?
Yeah, no, my Guyanul thing is my master's thesis.
Exactly.
And
he was talking
so
about
so
that.
I gave it to him to read after I arrived.
I see.
So I was accepted at Harvard primarily on the basis of the recommendations of the people that saw us. They said, "We want to get rid of him.
Right.
You have to take him."
Wow.
But again, it's my teachers had more confidence in me than I think they should have.
I don't think so, but I think they were right about you.
No, but what it meant is I had made a transition from being a student to someone who was publishing things. And, and I was a first-year graduate student at Harvard, so it really made a big difference.
Yes.
And those, I don't know if you've ever read them because it's the 17th century. but
Don't ask me that.
Well, I know you haven't. But those it's in 2 parts because it was so long. And I remember one of my fellow graduate students, after the first part came out in Harvard Journal, said, "Oh, now we're never going to see the second part." He didn't know the second part was already written. And,
Wow.
But that biography of Guyanul is basically still the standard all these years later on Guyanul. And there's a dissertation here, a very good dissertation at Yale. Another one I'm forgetting. But basically, they just accept what I did there and try and build on it and do other things. So I'm very pleased that has stood the test of time. No one's come along and said, "You didn't know any Chinese then." And
It's quite an accomplishment.
Well, again, I didn't know anything. I didn't know any better.
Well. So you've mentioned Toby a few times.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about her. You met her in college, right?
Well, I told you one of the important moments in my life was when L.S. Young told me that I could publish my master's thesis in the Harvard Journal, which is, at those days, it was the most prestigious English journal by far in Chinese studies. When I was a senior in high school in November of 1955, there was a thing called the football dance. So it had to be after the football season was over. So it was either the weekend before Thanksgiving or the weekend after Thanksgiving. We've never figured it out. I'm on a double date, and I'm with Sally Brenner, who's a very good friend. My good friend who were double dating is Morty Barnett. We had gone to Hawthorne School. Sally Brenner and Morty Barnett's girlfriend. Sally Brenner was not my girlfriend. We were just going on a date. Morty Barnett was very interested in this young lady, Penny Mavrellis, who was Toby's very best friend. Okay. They would talk 4 hours a night, drive their parents crazy on the telephone. So at this double date, we walk into the Oak Park High School gym, which is where the dance was, and this little person comes running up, and she's with a football player, and their date had been fixed up because he was on the football team as a junior, a rising senior, going to be a captain or something, and he needed a date. And so the coach, and then there's something Toby was involved in called a dance production. She was the leader of that, and she had to have a date to go to that. And so I'm pretty sure, because we cannot remember the boy's name. The football player's name.
She wasn't really interested.
No. And so she runs up to Penny Marvellis, who was her best friend, Sally Brenner, who was my date, was a very good friend. They had been together in grade school together. And Toby was just bubbling over with energy and telling him about learning how to drive and this wonderful thing, and it almost crashed the car and broke her father's tooth. And I said, "This is an utterly fascinating person." And I'd never really seen anyone like that who was just so, well, you know her, so she's very outgoing, and it's like nothing is disguised, and no matter what you think is right or wrong, she will do what she thinks is right. And she used to say that the football dance was in October. When she was still, her birthday is October 31st, and she said, "Oh, you met me when I was just 15." But actually, she was 2 weeks into being 16.
Wow.
So, so this was late November. In December, my friend said, "We're going to have a New Year's Eve party." Okay, so we all had to have a date. And so who was I going to call up to have a date? And so they said, "Well, you met this Toby person." So I called her up, and her mother answered. So then I had to call back. But anyway, she knew I was calling and could remind her of who I was. So December 31st, 1955, we went out on our first date. Every New Year's Eve since 1955, we have been together. We didn't get married until a few years later, but that one day is the day we've always been together since 1955. Is that answering your question of how we met?
Just so beautiful. It is
well,
beautiful.
it may be beautiful, but it also shows how kind of fortuitous life is. Because we hadn't met at that dance.
You could have never met her
Right.
at all.
Right.
Yeah. How did you make an impression on her? Because I know how she made an impression on you.
You probably have to ask her, but I'm convinced that I was committed to her from that first time I saw her.
Just saw her and she could see.
Well, I
it
didn't
in
probably
your eyes.
know. I didn't know it, and I wasn't explicit, but I'm pretty sure that I felt this is the one for me. Because the next year, then I went away to Rochester, so she had boyfriends, I had girlfriends, and so on. But we always stayed in touch. Every New Year's Eve, no matter who we were seeing, we still went out together. I went to her high school graduation the next year instead of with her boyfriend. So there was a kind of understood connection.
Yes,
Okay, and we maintained that connection for a very long time.
I know. To this day.
To this day.
To this